In the original version of World of Warcraft, often called Vanilla, there were 7 raid instances. 5 of these are still available for players to visit to this day, whereas the remaining 2, Sukurup and Naxxramas, were remade in later expansions. Meaning that the original versions, along with the loot that could be found inside, can only be accessed in the classic version of the game. What a lot of players don't know is that during World of Warcraft's development, there were even more raids that were initially intended to be part of the original game, but ended up being cut from development before its launch in 2004. One of these even made it all the way into the game world with its own fully developed zone terrain that was intended to set the scene for a raid instance where high-level players would fight against the demons and dragons that inhabited the zone. This is the story of Mount Hyjal. The zone of Mount Hyjal is known to most players as an entry leveling zone in the Cataclysm expansion. The main story revolves around defending the World Tree against the Twilight Hammer as well as the elemental forces found within Firelands. The story eventually culminates with players defeating Ragnaros, the Fire Lord, either banishing him to the elemental plane or dragging him out completely and killing him for good, depending on whether the raid is played on normal mode or the much more difficult heroic mode. Those who have played the Burning Crusade, either the classic version or the original 2007 expansion, may know Mount Hyjal as a raid found inside the Caverns of Time, which is a small area found within the Daenerys zone where players can go back in time and participate in events that happened in the past of Azeroth. In this version of the zone, the raid plays out the story of the Battle for Hyjal, an event that happened during the Third War, which is also part of the Night Elf campaign in the Warcraft 3 game. Here, players kill the Demon Lord Archimonde, preventing him from destroying the World Tree Nordosil, which is also known as Crown of the Heaven. Going back further to the original version of the game, also known as Vanilla, Mount Hyjal covered a large spot on the map that players couldn't zoom into and at the time didn't even have a name. Looking at old maps of Kalimdor that were published prior to World of Warcraft's release, the name Mount Hyjal can be seen in its place on the northern part of the continent. And within the game, players could zoom into one of the neighboring zones of Winterspring, Felwood or Ashenvale, where the blank area would simply be called Hyjal. While this wasn't much, there were also a few direct references to the zone that players could find within the game. Initially, these were all recounts of some of the events that happened during the battle for Mount Hyjal, which were told in small bits by various NPCs scattered around the game world. But the most extensive of these was the book called Mount Hyjal and Illidan's Gift, which could be found in either Darkshore or the Barrens. The zone is also the namesake of Hyjal Nectar, which was the strongest consumable in terms of mana regeneration when World of Warcraft first launched, although it didn't drop anywhere. This eventually changed when in the Burning Crusade expansion it was added to the loot table of some of the chests found in Outland zones, but by then it had long been surpassed by other consumables, even some from later patches in Vanilla. While the zone itself was inaccessible, having its only entrance blocked by a closed gate as well as an invisible wall, players did end up finding a way around it in the most literal sense, as they wall jumped up the mountains and then barely navigated around the invisible wall, followed by a few jumps down the mountain, after which they would find themselves in the Hyjal zone. A zone that, although using the same base as the one that players got to experience after the Cataclysm expansion, still looked quite different in many areas, especially in the southern half of the zone. The zone's main trail led up to the World Tree, where the giant skeleton of Archimonde, who had previously fallen during the battle for Mount Hyjal, could still be seen. Seeing as the zone wasn't meant to be accessible, there were no NPCs. But due to the beautiful scenery, it made for some good screenshots and was overall a nice place to explore. While jumping up the wall wasn't too difficult by itself, especially compared to other wall jumping spots, the area where the wall jump could be performed was quite deep into the Darkwhisper Gorge, a subzone that prior to the Cataclysm used to be inhabited by high-level demons, which prevented a lot of players from ever being able to attempt this wall jump. The wall jumping spot eventually ended up being fixed when the game's first expansion, the Burning Crusade, launched. And while it was initially still possible to get into the zone by longer and much more difficult wall jumping routes, Hyjal exploration would be dealt its final blow in patch 2.1.2, where the No Man's Land debuff was introduced. From this point onwards, any player entering the zone of Hyjal got the debuff and was immediately teleported out of the zone. While the No Man's Land debuff wasn't exclusively made for the Hyjal zone, player discussion about this new debuff mainly revolved around Hyjal, which goes to show how popular the zone was among explorers at the time. What a lot of players don't know is that Mount Hyjal was initially meant to be a level 60 raid zone. In an interview leading up to World of Warcraft's release, Jeff Kaplan, who is the former vice president of Blizzard Entertainment, gave a short tour of the northern part of Hyjal and described how it was to become a high-level raid zone, where players would be met by both demons and dragons. The objective of the raid was going to be for players to assist in purifying the second well of eternity, which is a pool of water that can be found just beneath the roots of the world tree Nordasil. Some remnants of these plants still made it into the official game when it released. One of these appeared in patch 1.4 when a new quest was introduced. This warlock-specific quest was called the Prison's Casing. And in the description of the quest, it is explained that the demons who occupy the foothills of Mount Hyjal secrete powerful poisons called Tears of the Heterin, which the player is sent to recover. More specifically, they aren't sent into Hyjal, but instead the Darkwhisper Gorge, which is located in the southern corner of the Winterspring Zone in Kalimdor. Upon venturing into the Darkwhisper Gorge, players were met by a subzone tightly packed with demons, all of which were high-level elites. Going deeper into the gorge, players found the cave which would have led them to the zone of Hyjal, had it not been for the gate sealing off the pathway between Winterspring and Hyjal. Behind the gate was a green-tinted portal, and at the time, a green-tinted portal always led to a raid zone as opposed to a blue portal, which led to dungeons as well as any other instanced area. While other instanced zones that were also guarded by high-level elites such as Diamol and Sul'Gruub were eventually finished and opened up to the player base, the portal into Mount Hyjal remained closed for the entirety of vanilla. Around other parts of Darkwhisper Gorge, players were able to find large skeletons of what appeared to be dragons, suggesting that some of the original plans for the Mount Hyjal zone being inhabited by battling demons and dragons, as was described in the interview, did actually end up making it into the game. Contrary to the Prison's Casing quest description, players did not find any demons when they managed to wall jump into the zone. But a possible explanation to this is that the Darkwhisper Gorge was initially meant to be a part of Hyjal instead of Winterspring, with the bridge in Frostwhisper Gorge serving as the border between the two zones. This would match the description made in the World of Warcraft sourcebook called Lands of Mystery, in which the Darkwhisper Gorge is described as being part of Mount Hyjal. Interestingly, the blue dragonflight is also mentioned as being part of the battle, although on the side of the player character. It's important to mention here that the Lands of Mystery isn't a one-to-one version of World of Warcraft, with even the description of Darkwhisper Gorge not matching perfectly with the real subzone in the game. But it does still give an idea of what plans the developers might have had for the zone at the time. And it should be said that in the Cataclysm expansion, when the open world Hyjal zone was finally finished, Darkwhisper Gorge did indeed become a part of the newly added Mount Hyjal, being removed from Winterspring, where it had previously been located for the first 6 years of the game's history. With this change, Darkwhisper Gorge itself also received a remake, getting a completely new theme, which led to the removal of both the elite demons and all their associated gameplay. Ever since Classic World of Warcraft was announced at the 2017 BlizzCon event, players have been speculating that the zone might be finished in a Classic Plus version of the game. For those unfamiliar with what Classic Plus is, it is basically a term used by players to describe an altered version of the original game, where changes are mostly kept at a minimal to ensure that the game functionally plays and feels like the original vanilla game, but with certain changes to some of the classes, as well as the completion of some of the content that was never fully finished during the game's development up to its release in 2004. Which regular viewers of this channel will know that there used to be a lot of, with some of it even making it into the live game, often by mistake. With the recent announcement of Season of Discovery, or some players call it Classic Plus, there is hope once again, perhaps more than ever, that the version of Mount Hyjal that was originally intended and teased just over 2 decades ago will finally become available to the player base.